Hey everyone, on the 30th of January I bought the RTX 5080 Founders Edition, which I was really happy about and excited about because for a long time I was looking to, invest in a new graphics card, and the 5080 Founders Edition seemed perfect to me. It was small form factor, it was the third fastest gaming card available, and it was also really good for content creation. It can even beat out the RTX 4090 sometimes, especially when rendering, which is really impressive. So why did I end up selling it? And I sold it at a slight loss as well. I didn't scalp it on eBay, I sold it for a slight loss. But why did I do that? Well, the first reason was that, as I actually mentioned in another video before I bought the RTX 5080, I was a little bit uncomfortable with just having 16 gigabytes of VRAM. It just doesn't always seem enough. And I know most games are absolutely fine with that. It's only really Indiana Jones at, maxed out settings that you will have an issue with. But in most other cases, 16 gigs is enough unless you're doing AI workloads. But because there was such a big gap between that and, the 5090 with 32 gigs of VRAM, I always suspected that actually NVIDIA were just going to bring out like a 5080 Super with more VRAM. And actually a couple of days ago at the time of filming, a load of rumors started coming out about that exact thing. So a 5080 Super with 24 gigs of VRAM. And so as a result, I always felt a little bit uneasy, spending like £1,000 or almost £1,000 on an RTX 5080 Founders Edition, knowing that maybe, later this year or the start of next year, it's just going to be superseded by the real 5080, the one that should have had 24 gigs of VRAM to begin with. So actually, from a slight, FOMO perspective, or advanced FOMO, if that is a real thing, I, was always a little bit uneasy about owning the 5080. So when the 9070 XT from AMD started coming out and all the benchmarks and leaks started coming out, I got really excited about that and thought that actually if I bought that, then it would be cheaper than a 5080. That could be, a really good, adequate replacement for my 5080, or at least something that could tide me over until like a 5080 Super comes out or something like that. So I bought the 9070 XT, I bought the cheapest one I could find, the Sapphire Pulse one. I almost paid MSRP price for it. I think I paid like £20 more than MSRP, but since then it's gone up in price. And actually, AMD done a brilliant job with the 9070 XT for gaming. It is brilliant for gaming, and FSR4 is a massive improvement. Or if a game doesn't support that, you can just use OptiScaler and actually inject FSR4 into a game, and that can work really well for games like Cyberpunk that don't natively support it. So that is brilliant, but for video editing, things were still quite jumpy. Like my old graphics card, the 6700 XT, that was always very jumpy and laggy when video editing, even when I made proxies, and unfortunately it was kind of the same with the 9070 XT. And that's not necessarily AMD's fault, but just in general, a lot of video editing software tends to prefer NVIDIA graphics cards, and so I sort of ended up in this situation because I have two computers where I had my RTX 5080 in one computer for video editing and then my 9070 XT in my other computer for gaming. And that always seemed a bit weird because I'd go to play a computer game with the 9070 XT, and then in the back of my mind I was kind of thinking, well, my 5080 is more powerful than this, especially if I want ray tracing and things like that. So that was a bit of a weird position to be in. And again, I actually wanted originally to buy the 9070 XT and then sell off my 5080, so downgrade from the 5080 to the 9070 XT. And that didn't work out because I do a lot of content creation, and NVIDIA cards unfortunately are a bit better for that, to be honest. The next reason I had some doubts about my 5080 was the 12-volt power connector. When that first came out on the 40 series and we had melting stories, people were blaming users quite a lot, especially with the 50 series, because the melting stories have carried on. People have dug a lot deeper into things and actually found that, just the 12-volt power connector is a bit crap, really. There's not as much safety headroom as there should be. And I know this more affects like the RTX 5090, which draws like 600 watts, and also the RTX 4090, but actually some 5080s have also melted. So I've always been a little bit uncomfortable about that, even though I have actually tested things quite a lot in previous videos and shown that often, the 12-volt power connector is fine and safe, especially for my 2 power supply units. But just in general, I always had those concerns as well, in addition to the concerns about, 16 gigs of VRAM and owning 2 fairly expensive graphics cards and all that. So essentially the concerns were starting to snowball in my mind. I also had some other concerns, which was that I had recently moved to a small form factor case for my RTX 5080. I built in the Corsair 2000D. It's an all-white build other than the graphics card, and actually it's a really nice build. I'm using that for my video editing. I can just chuck it in the corner and forget about it. And it's a really nice computer because it's mini ITX. But actually the downside of that particular case and small form factor builds in general is that, my 5080 was running very hot, especially when running things like FurMark or even Prime 95. I was averaging a lot more than than when my RTX 5080 was in my main Lian Li ATX case. And, you know, that's a bit of a concern as well. You know, the RTX 5080 is a very powerful graphics card, but with great power comes great output, I suppose. That's totally the saying, right? Now I know I could have undervolted the RTX 5080 and that would have helped with the cooling, and actually I also inserted 2 slimline fans in front of it, and actually that helped with cooling quite a lot as well. But just in general, all of these concerns were bubbling up, and I thought, you know, it is a bit overkill to have a 5080, especially now that I've got the 9070 XT, which does a good enough job for gaming. So when the RTX 5060 Ti came out, even though that was getting slaughtered by all the YouTube reviewers, I knew that it might have actually been perfect for me, because I wasn't going to use it for gaming. I simply wanted, you know, the video editing capability that the Blackwell architecture gives, and I wanted 16 gigs of VRAM, which obviously the 5060 Ti does offer if you're willing to spend like £399. So that's exactly what I did. I bought the Zotac Edge, which is the MSRP card here in the UK, and actually I installed it straight away, and it worked really well for video editing. You know, I could edit entire projects on it, and I got very, very minimal lag. It was almost on par with the RTX 5080. There's 1 or 2 very rare cases where actually, you know, I got a tiny bit of lag when video editing with the 5060 Ti that I wouldn't have had with the 5080, but certainly, you know, it didn't justify the actual difference in price. You know, I had my gaming system with the 9070 XT, and now I had a good enough video editing rig in a small form factor case with the 5060 Ti. And obviously because that's less power, it obviously run cooler, which was then perfect for my small form factor case. And actually that led to quite a good situation, because effectively the 5060 Ti, I mean, it only offers like 40 to 45% worse performance than a 5080, but it's like 60% cheaper. So from a price to performance ratio, actually I think the 5060 Ti 16 gig variant is actually a really good deal if it can do what you need it to do, which would either be like 1080p or maybe some level of 1440p gaming, or in my case, video editing. And actually it's really, really good for that. You know, it supports native 10-bit 422 video, it's got faster render times than the equivalent 40 series card, and obviously if you did want a game, I then had access to multi-frame generation and things like that. A final benefit as well is that I've kind of wanted to paint one of my graphics cards white for quite some time. I've ended up with 2 white cases, and yeah, I do want to do an all-white build. My mini ITX case is the closest to that. You know, it's got white cooler, white fans, white motherboard, white PSU, but not a white graphics card. You know, it wasn't white when I had the 5080, and obviously it's not white now that I've bought the Zotac Twin Edge. However, the Zotac card it looks like it's going to be a lot easier to dismantle than the Founders Edition will be. Plus, obviously, it's a bit less scary to dismantle like a £400 graphics card than a £1,000 graphics card. So I think at some point I will actually, you know, work up the nerve to actually dismantle my 5060 Ti and paint it white, maybe, and, you know, then I do have a true all-white build. And that is why I ended up selling my RTX 5080. And in terms of selling it, I touched on it in the intro, but I know I could have probably put it on eBay and got however much I got for it, but I didn't really want to do that. You know, I'm not a scalper, and also eBay is a bit of a weird system to actually sell on. Like, you could get scammed in certain cases with people, you know, claiming it doesn't work and then sending back the wrong graphics card or something like that. So as a result, I actually posted on Reddit, and I found somebody based in the UK who actually really wanted the card. They really into small form factor builds too, and I sold it to them for, you know, below MSRP. We both had a good deal, actually. You know, I just simply wanted to downgrade from a 5080 to a 5060 Ti, which I was able to do, and then they got, you know, a 5080 Founders Edition, which works really well in their particular case. But that is it. If you've got any questions though, please drop me a comment, and other than that, thank you for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please click the thumbs up button, and please subscribe to see more videos like this. Thanks for watching.